There is a hollow, suffocating kind of tragedy reserved for the woman who willingly sets her own kingdom on fire just to keep a man warm, only to watch him use the ashes to build a shrine to someone else. For 7 years, I believed that love was synonymous with invisible labor. I was Vivian Sterling, sole heiress to a multi-billion-dollar luxury real estate empire, born into a world where loyalty was a currency and every relationship was a transaction. Suffocated by the gilded cage of high society, I craved something authentic. I found it, or so I thought, in Julian. He was a charismatic, devastatingly broke tech developer who claimed the world had never given him a fair chance. He just needed one person to believe in him. I believed him so completely that when my ruthless, predatory father issued his final ultimatum, leave the grifter or be entirely disinherited, I chose the grifter. I walked away from my trust funds, my penthouses, and my family name, fully convinced I was stepping into a beautiful, authentic partnership. I traded silk sheets for the stained mattress of his leaking, roach-infested slum apartment, working grueling double shifts at a local diner just to keep the lights on while he tinkered with code. I was his provider, his cheerleader, and his silent partner. I thought we were forging an unbreakable bond. I never suspected that as soon as his logistics app caught fire and the venture capital started flooding in, he would view me not as his savior, but as a shameful, unsophisticated anchor. He thought he could quietly discard the poor woman who had funded his rise and walk away with the empire I had built for him. But Julian made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. You can strip an heiress of her trust fund, but you can never strip her of her bloodline. While he was busy plotting my eviction, he had no idea that I was just waiting for him to reach the mountaintop so I could kick the ladder out from under him. The descent into poverty was a shock to my system, but I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor. After my father formally severed my access to the family wealth, Julian and I moved into a cramped, damp, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. While Julian spent his days networking and sketching visionary designs in coffee shops he couldn't afford, I worked 3 different administrative jobs to keep the lights on. I answered phones, filed paperwork, and served coffee to the exact type of corporate executives I used to socialize with. Every spare dollar I earned went directly into Julian's startup firm, Etha Tech. I paid the incorporation fees. I bought his drafting software. I even sold the few pieces of designer jewelry I had kept to afford his first office lease. For over a decade, my life was a relentless cycle of financial anxiety and unwavering devotion. I was his secretary, his accountant, his cheerleader, and his sole provider. In our 7th year together, the impossible finally happened. Julian's firm landed a massive, city-defining contract to design a sprawling eco-commercial complex. The advance payments alone catapulted us into the stratosphere of the ultra-wealthy. We moved out of the miserable apartment and into a stunning, multi-million-dollar penthouse. I thought the struggle was finally over. I thought we had crossed the finish line together, ready to enjoy the life we had bled for. Instead, the wealth stripped away Julian's mask. He grew distant, arrogant, and cruel. He began attending elite social galas alone, claiming my poverty mindset would embarrass him in front of the investors. He treated me like a relic of a past he was eager to erase. The shattering truth came to light on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Julian had left for an emergency site inspection, leaving his primary secure laptop on his home office desk. He had recently changed his password, but he was a creature of habit, and I knew his mind better than he did. I bypassed the lock screen within 3 attempts. What I found in his encrypted files stopped my heart entirely. It was a digital paper trail of absolute destruction. Julian had been illegally embezzling millions of dollars from his primary investors, routing the funds through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies to purchase untraceable assets and luxury properties for Sloan, a wealthy, arrogant socialite who had routinely mocked my modest clothes at corporate dinners. But the sheer horror of the affair was eclipsed by the documents sitting in a subfolder labeled Exit Protocol. I opened the files, my hands trembling. Julian had forged my signature on every single document connecting the fraudulent offshore accounts to Etha Tech. He had drafted a timeline indicating his plan to trigger an anonymous tip to the SEC, simultaneously filing for an expedited divorce and liquidating the firm's remaining assets into a private account. He was going to run away to a non-extradition country with Sloan, leaving the federal authorities a perfectly crafted trail of forged evidence that pointed directly and exclusively to me. He was going to let me rot in federal prison to cover his tracks. I sat in the silence of his office, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The heartbroken, dedicated wife evaporated into the ether. In her place, the heiress awoke. I didn't panic. I didn't reach for my phone to confront him, nor did I collapse onto the hardwood floor in a puddle of tears. In the cutthroat world of the Sterling Dynasty, showing emotion when faced with a threat was a fatal flaw. You do not bleed in water filled with sharks, you simply become the bigger predator. I sat at his desk, staring at the forged documents bearing my stolen signature, and felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over me. Julian thought I was a soft, subservient woman who had spent 7 years fetching coffee and balancing checkbooks. He forgot that the first 18 years of my life were spent observing the most ruthless corporate titan on the eastern seaboard. He forgot who my father was. Over the next 6 hours, I utilized the high-level corporate security training my father had forced upon me when I was a teenager. I didn't just copy the files. I executed a complete, untraceable mirror of Julian's entire hard drive. I downloaded the forged incorporation documents, the offshore wire transfer confirmations, the IP addresses tied to the shell companies, and the nauseatingly arrogant text threads between him and Sloan discussing my impending federal incarceration. I secured a digital armory capable of incinerating his life 10 times over, saved it to an encrypted external drive, and wiped all trace of my access from his machine. When Julian returned home that evening, smelling of expensive bourbon and Sloane's cloying perfume, I greeted him in the kitchen with a warm, placid smile. "How was the site inspection?" I asked, handing him a glass of sparkling water. "Exhausting," he sighed, loosening his silk tie with a practiced air of importance. "The investors are breathing down my neck about the upcoming merger. It's non-stop, Vivian. You have no idea the kind of pressure I'm under to keep this lifestyle afloat." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his performance was almost impressive. He was standing in a kitchen I had scrubbed, complaining about the pressure of maintaining a lifestyle he was actively plotting to steal from me. "I know you work so hard, Julian," I said, keeping my voice soft, compliant, and perfectly level. I turned and offered him a warm, supportive smile. "Just tell me what you need me to do to make things easier for you." He offered a patronizing chuckle, stepping forward to pinch my cheek as if I were a naive child. "Just keep doing what you do. Keep the house quiet. I handle the heavy lifting." I let him eat the dinner I prepared. I played the role of the oblivious, simple-minded domestic partner to absolute perfection, masking a lethal, freezing rage behind every nod and every smile. I allowed him to feel completely secure in his superiority, knowing that his arrogance would be his ultimate undoing. The moment he fell asleep that night, the heavy, rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the master bedroom, I slipped out from under the covers. I walked softly into his home office and booted up his laptop. Julian was a brilliant software engineer, but he was a remarkably sloppy criminal. He assumed my brain only functioned in terms of tip percentages and grocery budgets. He forgot that before I was serving coffee, I was the heiress who had taught him how to read a profit and loss statement on the floor of our drafty studio apartment. He forgot that I was the one who had set up his initial corporate firewall. I knew his passwords. I knew his security questions. By 200A. I had bypassed the basic encryption on his private drive. What I found inside was not just a case for divorce. It was a sprawling, meticulously documented felony. Julian hadn't just been cheating on me with Sloan. He had been funding her high society lifestyle using seed capital from his Series B investors. I pulled up the internal ledgers and cross-referenced them with the hidden offshore accounts he had bragged about in his texts. The digital paper trail was undeniable. He had set up a dummy shell corporation, billing his own startup for external algorithm consulting, and funneling millions of dollars out of the company's operating budget. I traced the money. There were wire transfers for a $4 million penthouse in the financial district, deeded exclusively to Sloan. There were receipts from Cartier, private jet charters to Aspen, and exorbitant charges at Michelin-starred restaurants. He was systematically bleeding his own company dry, artificially inflating the company's valuation to secure the upcoming merger, and hiding the liquid cash to ensure I wouldn't see a single cent of it when he inevitably handed me divorce papers. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the stolen millions. It was the genesis of his company's equity structure. When Julian first incorporated 7 years ago, he couldn't get a bank loan. I had funded the initial incorporation using a forgotten, low-yield municipal bond that my father's lawyers had somehow overlooked when they disinherited me. Because my name was the only one on that bond, the initial seed capital for Julian's startup was entirely mine. According to the original incorporation documents I was currently staring at, I wasn't just his wife. I was technically the foundational majority shareholder of his entire empire. I spent the next 4 hours downloading every ledger, every forged invoice, and every offshore wire transfer onto an encrypted external hard drive. When the sun began to rise over the California hills, I closed the laptop, leaving it exactly as I had found it. I had the ammunition, but to execute the kind of total, scorched earth destruction Julian deserved, I needed a weapon far bigger than a divorce attorney. I needed a monopoly. 3 days later, while Julian was away at a tech conference, which GPS tracking confirmed was actually a weekend in Napa Valley with Sloan, I dressed in the only piece of designer clothing I had kept from my past, a sharp, structured black blazer that screamed corporate warfare. I drove downtown to the financial district and pulled up to a towering monolith of black glass and steel. The Sterling Building. Walking into that lobby for the first time in a decade felt like stepping into a parallel universe. The air was cold, smelling of polished marble and expensive leather. The security guards didn't recognize the 32-year-old woman in front of them, but when I approached the front desk and spoke my name, the receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard. "Tell Arthur Sterling his daughter is here," I commanded, my voice carrying the unmistakable, inherited cadence of absolute authority. "And tell him I brought a highly lucrative acquisition target." 10 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors of the CEO's office swung open. My father was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He had aged, his hair was completely silver now, but his presence was as terrifying and immovable as a mountain. He turned slowly, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning me from head to toe. He didn't rush forward to hug me. He didn't offer a tearful apology. We were Sterlings, we didn't do sentiment. We did business. 10 years, Vivian, my father said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. I assumed you would eventually get tired of playing house with a vagrant. Are you here to ask for your allowance back? I don't want an allowance, Arthur, I said, walking directly to his massive desk. I didn't sit down. I reached into my bag, pulled out the encrypted hard drive, and dropped it onto the polished wood with a heavy thud. I want a partnership, and I want to hand you the most profitable tech acquisition of the fiscal year for pennies on the dollar. My father arched a silver eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. He walked over to the desk and stared at the drive. Explain. Julian's company is finalizing a massive merger next month, I said, my voice cold and clinical. He's currently valued at $200 million, but his valuation is a fraud. He has been aggressively embezzling from his Series B investors to fund a mistress. The proof is on that drive. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every forged invoice. My father picked up the drive, rolling it thoughtfully between his fingers. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing as he searched my face for weakness, for heartbreak, for the naive girl who had walked out on him 7 years ago. He found nothing but ice. He stole from his investors, my father mused, a dark, dangerous smile slowly pulling at the corner of his mouth. And he cheated on you. He made a business decision to liquidate my future, I corrected smoothly. I am simply responding in kind. According to the original incorporation documents, I am the majority shareholder of his tech firm. I want you to initiate the merger through one of our subsidiary shell companies. I want you to be the buyer he thinks he's selling to. My father let out a sharp, genuine laugh, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. The respect in his eyes was immediate and absolute. He recognized the ruthless, calculated strike of a predator. He recognized his blood. You want me to buy him out, Arthur said, leaning against the edge of his desk. And then what? Then, I said, my eyes completely dead, we present the forensic audit to the board right as the ink dries. We terminate him as CEO for criminal fraud, we strip him of his remaining equity, and we leave him personally liable for the millions he embezzled. He walks away with nothing but the clothes on his back. Arthur Sterling looked at the daughter he thought he had lost to weakness, realizing that the time in the slums hadn't broken me, it had forged me into a weapon. Welcome home, Vivian, my father said softly, sliding the hard drive across his desk toward his private terminal. Let's go hunting. The morning of the merger arrived with a thick, rolling coastal fog that swallowed the San Francisco skyline, a fittingly dramatic backdrop for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. Inside our modern, minimalist home, Julian was a vibrating wire of nervous, arrogant energy. He stood in front of the hallway mirror, meticulously adjusting the Windsor knot of a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, his eyes alight with a greedy, feverish anticipation. Today was the day he believed he would officially ascend to the ranks of the untouchable elite. Today was the day he would sign a $200 million acquisition deal with a private conglomerate, cash out his shares, and shed the dead weight of his past. I stood in the kitchen, dressed in a faded, oversized sweater and yoga pants, pouring him a cup of black coffee. I played the part of the devoted, exhausted waitress one final time. I won't be home for dinner tonight, Julian said, not bothering to look at me as he took the coffee cup from my hands. He took a sip, grimaced slightly, and set it down on the granite counter. Actually, Vivian, we need to have a serious conversation this weekend. I've outgrown this dynamic. I'm going to need you to start looking for your own place. The company's legal team will send over some preliminary separation documents on Monday. I'll make sure you get a generous lump sum to help you get back on your feet. A generous lump sum. A severance package for 7 years of my life, offered by a man who had built his empire using my blood, my sweat, and my stolen inheritance. I understand, Julian, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion, a blankness he entirely mistook for defeated submission. Good luck today. I hope you get exactly what you deserve. I always do, he smirked, grabbing his leather briefcase. The front door clicked shut behind him, and the heavy, suffocating illusion of our 7-year marriage instantly evaporated into the morning air. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I walked into the master bathroom, turned on the scalding hot water, and washed away the smell of the diner, the grime of the struggle, and the pathetic, compliant persona of Vivian the waitress. When I stepped out, I drove directly to the Sterling estate in Pacific Heights. Waiting for me in my childhood bedroom was a styling team my father had summoned at dawn, alongside a garment bag delivered directly from a high-end European boutique. I stripped away the cheap cotton and stepped into a razor-sharp, stark white Alexander McQueen suit. I clasped a vintage diamond choker around my neck, a piece of jewelry that cost more than Julian's entire Series A funding round. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon, and my lips were painted a deep, unapologetic crimson. When I looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I didn't recognize the woman who had spent 7 years agonizing over grocery bills. I saw Vivian Sterling. I saw an apex predator. Downstairs, my father was waiting in the grand foyer, flanked by 3 men in dark suits, the most terrifying, ruthless corporate litigators on the West Coast. Arthur Sterling looked at me, a rare, genuine smile of approval breaking across his stoic features. The buyer's representatives are already in the boardroom, my father noted, checking his platinum Patek Philippe watch. Julian is preparing to sign. Are you ready to close the deal, Vivian? I've been ready for 7 years, I replied. We stepped into the back of a blacked-out Maybach, gliding silently through the city streets toward the glass and steel monolith where Julian's tech firm was headquartered. On the 50th floor, inside a sprawling, glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the foggy bay, Julian was holding court. From the hallway, through the slightly parted double doors, I could see the scene perfectly. Julian was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Sitting directly to his right, wearing a sickeningly smug smile and the $4 million Cartier necklace Julian had purchased with embezzled funds, was Sloane. She was there under the guise of an independent PR consultant, but everyone in the room knew her true role. She was waiting to be crowned. At the opposite end of the table sat the acquisition team for Apex Holdings, the shell company my father had created specifically to facilitate this trap. They sat in stony silence, their briefcases open, the $200 million merger contracts resting in the center of the table. I want to thank the representatives from Apex for their incredible foresight, Julian announced to the room, standing up and buttoning his jacket, preparing to deliver his victorious monologue. When I started this company, I had nothing but a vision. I built this from the ground up, utilizing my own genius, my own sweat, and my own unparalleled drive. Today's acquisition is not just a merger. It is a validation of self-made brilliance. It proves that with the right leadership and the right people by your side. He gestured warmly to Sloane, who beamed back at him. There is absolutely no limit to what can be achieved. He reached into his breast pocket, unscrewed the cap of a solid gold Montblanc fountain pen, and leaned over the thick stack of contract papers. "You're about to sign the wrong line, Julian," I said. My voice cut through the sterile, quiet air of the boardroom like a gunshot. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open, pushed wide by my father's security detail. I stepped into the room, my white suit practically glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights, the diamonds at my throat catching the glare. My father walked in immediately behind me, followed by our trio of corporate litigators. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. Julian froze, the gold pen hovering an inch above the signature line. His jaw unhinged, his eyes widening in a mixture of profound confusion and rising terror. He looked at my designer clothes, the diamonds, and the terrifying posture of absolute authority I commanded. He couldn't reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the waitress he had dismissed just 3 hours earlier. Sloane let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes darting between me and my father. She recognized Arthur Sterling immediately. In the high society circles she occupied, my father was a god. "Vivian," he stammered, his voice trembling, the confident facade shattering instantly. What are you doing here?" "Security." "How did she get up here?" "Security works for the building owner, Mr. Vance," Arthur Sterling rumbled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He stepped forward, his presence suffocating the room. "And I own this building, just as I own Apex Holdings, the company you are currently attempting to sell to." Julian looked as though he had been physically struck. He stared at my father, then slowly turned his horrified gaze back to me. "Apex, you, Vivian, what is this? Who are these people?" "My name is Vivian Sterling," I said, walking slowly toward the head of the table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. "And these men are my legal counsel. You'll want to put the pen down, Julian. You don't have the legal authority to sign that document." "What are you talking about?" He barked, a desperate, panicked anger flaring in his eyes as he tried to regain control of his boardroom. "This is my company. I am the CEO, the founder, and the majority shareholder. You're my wife, you have no standing here." "I have every standing here," I interrupted, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning in so close I could smell the stale fear sweating out of his pores. 7 years ago, you couldn't get a bank to look at you, let alone secure a business loan. You needed $25,000 to formally incorporate, lease server space, and patent your algorithm. I funded that initial capitalization using a municipal bearer bond. I snapped my fingers without looking away from his eyes. My lead attorney stepped forward, dropping a thick, red-tabbed legal binder directly onto the contract Julian had been about to sign. A municipal bearer bond, my attorney stated loudly for the entire room to hear, that was drawn exclusively from the Vivian Sterling Irrevocable Trust. According to California corporate law and the foundational articles of incorporation you filed 7 years ago, that seed capital does not classify as a marital asset. It classifies as a direct equity investment by the Sterling Trust. Which means, Mr. Vance, my client does not own 50% of this company through marriage. She owns 85% of the voting shares through direct foundational equity. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. I watched the blood completely drain from Julian's face, leaving his skin the color of dirty parchment. The air was sucked out of his lungs. He looked at the binder, his eyes wildly scanning the highlighted articles of incorporation that proved he was nothing more than a minority stakeholder in the empire he thought he ruled. "No," Julian whispered, stumbling backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. "No, that's impossible. You were broke. We were broke." "I was never broke, Julian. I was just in love," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "I gave up a $1 billion inheritance to sleep in a roach-infested studio apartment with you because I believed you had a soul. I spent 7 years waiting tables to build your pedestal. And how did you repay me?" I didn't wait for his answer. I picked up a second folder from my attorney's hands and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped directly in front of Sloan. "You repaid me by forging consulting invoices," I announced, raising my voice so the remaining board members could hear every damning syllable. "You embezzled $12 million of Series B investor capital to buy a penthouse and Cartier jewelry for your mistress. You artificially inflated the valuation of this firm to facilitate a fraudulent cash-out merger, planning to bankrupt the marital accounts and leave me with nothing." Sloan scrambled backward in her chair, pushing away from the table as if the folder were coated in anthrax. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with a panicked, aristocratic revulsion. "Julian," Sloan demanded, her voice shrill and trembling, "is this true? Did you steal that money?" "It's not what it looks like," Julian pleaded, his hands shaking violently as he looked between me, Sloan, and my father. "Vivian, please, we can figure this out. We're married. We built this together." "We didn't build anything together," I said, my posture perfectly straight, looking down at the man I had once thought was my entire world. "I built you, and now I'm tearing you down." The silence in the boardroom stretched, agonizing and heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and impending professional ruin. Julian looked as if the very air had been sucked out of the room, his chest heaving as he stared at the financial audit spread across the table. His hand, still clutching the gold fountain pen, shook uncontrollably. He tried to open his mouth, to offer a rebuttal, to weave another of his charming, manipulative lies, but the words died in his throat. He looked toward Sloan, hoping for a lifeline, but she had retreated into the corner, her face pale, frantically tapping on her own phone, undoubtedly deleting messages and severing their connection before the inevitable collapse took her down with him. The 3 corporate litigators my father had provided were already working, distributing copies of the forensic audit and the original incorporation documents to the Apex Holdings acquisition team. The lead representative from Apex, a man whose face had been a mask of stone since the meeting began, slowly closed his briefcase. He turned his chair toward the head of the table, his gaze locking onto Julian with a look of clinical, detached professional disgust. "Mr. Vance," the representative began, his voice cold and devoid of any corporate politeness. "We were brought here today under the assumption that we were acquiring a legitimate, high-growth enterprise. We were not briefed on the fact that the company's foundational capital was misappropriated, nor were we aware that the current CEO was using investor funds to finance personal criminal activity. This entire deal is tainted by fraud. We are pulling our offer, effective immediately. Furthermore, we are initiating our own internal investigation to report these findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Julian's legs gave way, and he slumped back into his leather chair, a hollow, broken shell of the man who had walked in that morning. The $200 million future he had spent 7 years stealing had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. He wasn't just a failed CEO, he was a liability that the industry would now treat like a radioactive waste site. I didn't offer him a look of sympathy. I stood by my father, who was watching the scene with the grim, satisfied expression of a man witnessing the predictable end of an amateur. "The board of directors for Etha Tech," I announced, my voice clear and ringing in the sterile room, "has reviewed the evidence of financial misconduct. As the majority shareholder, I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence. Julian Vance, you are hereby terminated as CEO for cause. Security has been instructed to escort you from the building. You are to surrender all company keys, devices, and access codes. You are to depart the premises immediately." Julian tried to speak, his voice a pathetic, broken rasp. "Vivian, please, we can talk about this. Don't do this to me. We have 7 years. We have a life." I walked around the table, stopping just inches from him. I leaned down, lowering my voice so only he could hear the full, biting truth. "You didn't have a life, Julian. You had a host. You had 7 years of charity, and you chose to spit in the face of the woman who made you. You aren't a CEO. You're a grifter who forgot who bought him his first suit." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and frantic, realizing for the first time that the waitress who had cooked his meals and waited tables for 7 years had never really left. The billionaire heiress had been watching him the entire time, waiting for the exact moment when he would be arrogant enough to think he had won. "Get him out of my sight," I said, standing back up and turning my back on him. 2 security guards, massive men in dark suits, stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the elbows. He didn't fight back. He was already defeated, his body limp and trembling as they hauled him toward the double doors. Sloane, watching the spectacle from the corner, clutched her handbag and bolted for the hallway, hoping to disappear before the board members could turn their attention to her. I didn't care about her. She was a symptom, not the disease. As the boardroom doors slammed shut behind Julian, muffling his pathetic, desperate protests, the lead attorney for my father stepped forward, holding a thick, stapled document. "The post-nuptial severance agreement, Vivian," he said, handing me the final, notarized document. "It's all here. The debt liability, the equity forfeiture, the admission of guilt for the misappropriated funds. It's ironclad." I took the document, my fingers feeling steady and light. I signed the last page, finalizing the absolute, permanent severance of my life from his. My father stood up, walking over to stand beside me at the head of the mahogany table. He looked out over the city skyline, the fog beginning to burn off under the mid-morning sun. "You handled that with the precision of a master, Vivian. I underestimated you." "You underestimated the sterling name," I corrected, looking out at the city I had spent 7 years trying to stay out of, and which I now realized I was perfectly capable of running. "What now?" my father asked. "The board needs a permanent leader. The company is in shambles, but the technology is sound. It's a clean slate." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members who had once been intimidated by Julian's arrogant, fake charisma. Now they were waiting for my direction. They were waiting to see if I was just a ghost from the past or the future of the firm. "We restructure," I said, my voice authoritative and calm. "We bring back the core engineering team Julian sidelined. We pivot the R&D back to the original algorithm he ignored because he was too busy chasing venture capital for his side hustles. And we rebrand. We remove the Vance name from every piece of stationery, every building, and every server. By tomorrow morning, this firm will be Sterling Tech. And we will become the industry leader within 6 months." My father nodded, a glint of genuine, fierce respect in his eyes. He had spent his life waiting for someone who could carry the weight of his legacy, never imagining that the daughter he thought he had lost would be the one to save it. I turned to the board members. "We have a great deal of work to do. Let's begin." As the board members scrambled to pull out their laptops and open the new project files, I felt a strange, electric sensation in my chest. It wasn't the thrill of revenge. Revenge was a hollow, temporary satisfaction. It was the profound, exhilarating realization of competence. I was good at this. I had been good at this before I ever met Julian, and I had refined my skills in the crucible of poverty and struggle. He had tried to steal my life and sell it for parts, but he had failed to realize that the person he was stealing from was the only one who actually knew how to run the machine. I sat at the head of the table, the same place he had sat hours ago, and began to work. The rest of the boardroom was filled with the sounds of keyboards clacking, people discussing logistics, and the quiet, productive hum of a company finally being run by the person who had actually built it. I felt no bitterness for the lost years and no regret for the sacrifices I had made. The past was exactly where it belonged, behind me, and for the first time in 7 years, the future was entirely my own to design. I wasn't reclaiming my throne. I was building a brand new one, and this time, it was built on a foundation that not even a catastrophe could tear down. The transition from a waitress to the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire was not a struggle. It was an unleashing. Without Julian's bloated ego, reckless spending, and constant need for validation draining the company's resources, Sterling Tech didn't just recover, it skyrocketed. I streamlined operations, finalized the commercial expansion ahead of schedule, and secured international development contracts that Julian could never have dreamed of negotiating. My personal life underwent a similarly beautiful renovation. I finalized the divorce with lethal efficiency. Because Julian was drowning in corporate debt and facing severe legal penalties for his fraud, he couldn't afford to fight me in court. I stripped him of everything, exactly as he had planned to do to me. I sold the modern glass house that held the ghost of our marriage and purchased a breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse overlooking the city skyline. I filled my life with art I loved, travel I had previously put off, and a circle of brilliant, genuine peers who respected my intellect rather than feeling threatened by it. I had spent 7 years playing a supporting character in my own life. Now, I was the undeniable lead. 8 months after the boardroom coup, I was leaving a high-end restaurant following a dinner with international investors. It was a crisp, clear evening, the city lights reflecting off the damp pavement. As I waited under the restaurant's awning for my driver to bring the car around, a voice called out from the sidewalk. "Vivian." I turned. Standing a few feet away, holding a stack of cheap, glossy promotional flyers for a low-rent apartment complex, was Julian. The physical deterioration was staggering. The custom-tailored suits and the expensive haircuts were gone. He was wearing a slightly frayed, off-the-rack blazer that hung loosely on his shoulders. He looked aged, haggard, and thoroughly defeated. The federal investigations had bankrupted him entirely. He had clearly been reduced to hustling tourists and desperate renters as a low-level leasing agent just to survive. He stared at me, his eyes wide, a frantic mixture of shame, regret, and a pathetic, desperate hope pooling in his gaze. He looked at my tailored designer coat, the relaxed, vibrant posture I carried, and the undeniable aura of a woman who was thriving in every possible way. "Vivian," he choked out, his voice cracking, completely ignoring professional protocol. He took a hesitant half-step toward me, his hands raising in a pathetic, desperate plea. "Vivian, my God, please, I have nothing. I'm drowning in the restitution payments. I sleep in my car. Please, I was so wrong, just give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to talk to you, I'm begging you." He was waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for the soft, empathetic woman who had once skipped meals just to buy him a suit. He wanted me to yell at him, to gloat, or to offer him the vindictive, furious speech he had probably rehearsed in his head 1,000 times. He wanted me to show him that he still mattered, that his betrayal still held some kind of emotional weight in my universe. I looked at him, truly looked at him, searching my chest for the heartbreak, the rage, or even the bitter satisfaction of revenge. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. He wasn't the love of my life, and he wasn't my greatest enemy. He was just a tired, broken man carrying leaflets for people who actually did the work. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile, and I didn't scowl. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a crisp, single $100 bill, and held it out to him. Julian stared at the money, his face crumbling as the absolute, chilling reality of my indifference washed over him. His hands shook as he slowly reached out and took the bill. I offered him a single, dismissive nod, stepped into the back of my car, and closed the door. As the car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the glittering city traffic, I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I was entirely focused on the road ahead, a valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from Vivian's journey, it is this: never sacrifice your inherent worth to build a pedestal for someone who does not respect the foundation you provided. For 7 years, Vivian defined her worth by her capacity to endure. She mistakenly believed that if she just gave a partner enough resources, enough grace, and enough belief, he would transform into a king who stood by her side. But when you build a foundation for someone who only loves the view, they will eventually try to push you off the ledge so they don't have to share the penthouse. Society often conditions us to believe that the greatest expression of devotion is self-erasure, that we must quietly manage our partner's insecurities, do the heavy lifting in the shadows, and let them take the credit to keep the peace. But a parasite does not respect the host that feeds it. It only grows arrogant as it consumes. True independence isn't just about the wealth you acquire or the title you hold. It is the absolute, uncompromising refusal to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Do not let your intellect, your grit, or your loyalty be the fuel for someone else's greed. True partnership requires equality, not erasure. If you find yourself constantly pouring your energy into someone who takes the credit while leaving you in the shadows, have the courage to audit your life. Reclaim your assets, step out of the background, and remember, if you are strong enough to build the empire, you are more than capable of sitting on the throne yourself.